Okay, folks, hi, this is Diana Phillip with NARAL Pro-Choice Maryland. And I thank you for joining us with this particular webinar. We are very happy to have with us Carol Joffe, who's a sociologist and who's been working for years on abortion rights and abortion provision, and David Cohen, who's a law professor from Drexel. And they've worked, actually they had a book last year, right, that you guys had done together, and now we've got a new book that we're very excited for you folks to know about. But I also wanted to let everyone know that we've decided to go ahead and have this recorded. So if you're concerned about that, and you can make a decision whether or not you want to stay on. If everybody's got their video off, that's helpful for you. If you can adjust your view, I believe you can do that for speaker only. That might be something that is more manageable than seeing all these different faces. And that's what I've learned in doing these Zoom calls. So with that, feel free to use the chat function if there's some kind of logistic problem. And I think that's all the housekeeping that I have to say. So take it away, David and Carol.
Good. Carol, you want to start off and then I'll go into the PowerPoint?
Sure. Well, I just want to say it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Diana, for organizing this. And it's very nice to see, in some cases, the faces, in other cases, the names of people, not just from Maryland, but from all over the place. And I'm very grateful that you all showed up, and I look forward to an interesting conversation.
Same here. I'm excited to be here and see familiar names and faces and a bunch of new people as well. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. Carol and I are going to talk about our book for, 40 minutes or so, and then leave open a lot of time for discussion, conversation, questions. So we've got a PowerPoint that has just a few slides. So I'm going to try and share that. And then we will start. So let me do this. Okay, are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, all good. So, thank you, Diana, for the introduction. And we are here to talk about our new book, which came out just a couple months ago, right before we all went into lockdown. It's called Obstacle Course: The Everyday Struggle to Get an Abortion in America. We've got, Carol and I are going to trade off talking about each chapter, because I'll tell you how it's organized, and that'll hopefully make sense. And so you'll hear from each of us at different points. I'm going to start by just, I'm going to do a mix of talking and also reading, but I'm going to start by reading a story that we start the book with, a story from Talia. So Talia was 15 years old and had just started getting her period earlier in the year. As happens with many young women, her period was erratic, so she didn't realize she was pregnant until several months had gone by. When she did find out, having just graduated middle school and essentially raising herself, thanks to a father who wasn't around and a mother who wasn't dependable, she was certain she wanted and needed an abortion. But making the decision herself was not an option for Talia. Like young women in about 3/4 of states, as a minor, Talia was not entitled to make her own choice. In Talia's state, one parent had to be notified and give consent to the abortion. The consenting parent had to provide government-issued identification so the consent could be notarized. Talia had the support of an adult in her life, her boyfriend's grandmother, but she didn't qualify under state law as a person who could consent. With one parent missing and the other only sporadically involved in her life, Talia's only option was to go before a judge who could, after a hearing, sign off on her abortion. Going before a judge in any circumstance is not an experience most people would relish, but doing so when you're a minor faced with an unwanted pregnancy can be terrifying. Thankfully, Talia lived in a state that had a well-run organization whose sole purpose was to assist minors navigating this process. Talia contacted the organization, who connected her with an attorney to help her fill out the paperwork and appear before the judge. However, before Talia could do that, she arranged to have an initial appointment at the local abortion clinic. Where Talia lived, state law required people to make a separate trip to the clinic 24 hours before the abortion. So Talia made the appointment and showed up at the clinic for her pre-abortion counseling and ultrasound. When she got to the clinic, she realized something was wrong and that the building she had entered wasn't actually an abortion clinic after all. Rather, she was in a fake women's health center, generically known as Crisis Pregnancy Center, but also sometimes called fake clinics. This center, which was not a medical facility, but rather posed as one, was located directly next door to the actual abortion clinic and did everything it could to make itself look like the clinic, the same building design and a similar name. Talia was tricked into going there. Once Talia was inside, the people there, who wore white coats to look like doctors, pretended that they knew Talia had an appointment. But when Talia told them that she wanted to have an abortion, they tried to persuade her otherwise. They told her that they would help her support her baby with money and other forms of assistance. When Talia remained confident in her decision, they brought someone in who told Talia she herself had an abortion and that it had ruined her life. Finally, when Talia said that she still wanted an abortion, the people at the center brought out the most dangerous lie of them all. They told Talia they could perform the abortion, but that Talia had to wait a few weeks because they didn't have an open appointment. Talia was already 19 weeks pregnant, and waiting a few weeks would have put her over the state's limit on when a woman could have an abortion. In other words, the center lied to Talia so that she would never be able to exercise her right to choose. When Talia left the appointment at the fake clinic, she called the organization that helped minors through the process. The people there quickly identified the fake clinic and told Talia she was at the wrong place. Talia was shocked. "I thought I was in a real doctor's office," she said. "I don't get it." Thanks to the help of the organization, the attorney, and then the real abortion clinic, Talia was able to get the judge's approval without any problems. But Talia's journey to get an abortion wasn't over. She still needed to come up with the money. She didn't have health insurance that covered the abortion, so she had to come up with $4,000 out of pocket. She and her boyfriend's grandmother pulled together some money, but it wasn't enough. Thankfully, local and national organizations dedicated to helping low-income women pay for abortions stepped in. They made the difference, and Talia was able to get her abortion just before the state's limit kicked in. With her abortion behind her, Talia started 9th grade, free to pursue her education without being a parent when she didn't want to be. But for her to get to this point, she had to navigate the complex web of laws that deprive young women of their autonomous decision-making, the deception of fake clinics, the time pressure of a state's gestational limit, and the difficulty that low-income women have in finding money for a procedure many insurance companies don't cover. Talia was successful, but with so many hurdles in place, other women aren't always so fortunate. Our book tells the story of what we call abortion exceptionalism, the idea that abortion is treated uniquely compared to other medical procedures that are comparable to abortion in complexity and safety. What we do in this book is discuss what often gets overlooked in the abortion battle, the real consequences for people who seek abortion and for those who provide them. Every step along the way, from the moment someone finds out she's pregnant to the point of getting an abortion, law and politics interfere in this decision. And that's what we document in this book. We document the interference, the lengths to which abortion providers go to nonetheless provide high quality medical care, and the tenacity patients must have in order to make the process work for them. So what we do in this book, we interviewed over 70 abortion providers all over the country, covering every state in the country and the 2 major territories, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. And we talked with them about all the barriers that their patients face in getting an abortion, what impact that has on the patients, and how they, as providers, are able to still provide excellent medical care despite these barriers. We also complement throughout this, so the bulk of the backbone of this book is stories of providers, but we also complement the stories of providers with the stories of patients. They're publicly available sources. We ourselves did not interview patients about their stories. We took stories from other places. The organization of the book, and that's how Carol and I will be talking today, we organized the book sort of along the way, every step that a patient faces in getting a procedure, from the moment she finds out she's pregnant to getting the procedure. So we talk about first the decision to have an abortion, then finding and getting to an abortion provider, then paying for the abortion, getting into the clinic, counseling at the clinic, waiting before the procedure, and the procedure itself. Because we feel that putting it in this order and putting it in this way, combining all the barriers in this format, shows the extent to which the barriers exist around the country, making it extremely difficult for patients to access an abortion. Nonetheless, and in some ways this could be a very depressing book, we feel like there is a lot of optimism here, because thanks to patients' own commitment, as well as the dedication and innovation of providers, allies, and volunteers, women in America who seek an abortion still, for now, get legal, safe abortions. As one abortion provider we interviewed told us, women will walk over hot rocks to find an abortion provider. If you need one, and you go where you can. So I'm going to turn to chapter 2 of the book, which is making the decision to have an abortion. Every abortion story is different, but also in some ways the same. People don't want to be pregnant anymore for whatever reason, and don't want to end their pregnancy by giving birth. As one director of a fund, an abortion fund, told us, as she laid out all the different reasons she had heard from patients about why they wanted abortion. And the quote here is on the screen. So they can finish high school, so they can go to college, so they can finish college, so they can finish training programs, be a good parent to the kids they have, get away from guys that are not good for them, stay with guys that they like who don't want them to have a kid, because they understand parenting and they don't want to do it. Maybe they want to make art. But for most of them, if it's that they're struggling to get by, they're struggling to put food on the table, struggling to afford housing, struggling to have kids stay in the same school for the full year, struggling to stay off the street, struggling to stay safe, don't want to be in a shelter, trying to keep kids away from the county agency. But we know from studies that have looked at the reasons why people have abortions, mainly there are 2 reasons: that having a baby would interfere with work, education, or caring for children or dependents, and 2, that they can't afford to have a baby at this point in their lives. There are other reasons, but they really fall into those 2 main buckets. Now, if this were normal medical care or other medical care, the whole point of our book is that abortion should be treated like normal medical care. But if this were looked at like any other form of medical care, women would be able to make this medical decision on the basis of their own reasons, and they would be able to decide whether to consult others. Whether it's the reason that other people approve or not, they would still be able to get the care. But the same is not true for making the decision to have an abortion. People have abortions for any of the reasons mentioned here, or any of the other possible reasons. Have this procedure routinely encounter roadblocks that people making other medical decisions never experience. They're cared for by doctors who give them misinformation that is protected by law. They go to publicly funded health centers that are prohibited by law from talking with them about their decision. They are told by law that they cannot have an abortion for certain reasons. They encounter, like the story that started this session, fake clinics or anti-abortion websites that give false information about abortion. Or they're minors who are forced by law to have a parent or guardian be involved with their decision, possibly even overriding it. And I just want to highlight 2 of the things that we talk about in this book, or in this chapter, other than the minors and the fake clinics, because that was in the story that started. 1, medical providers' interference. And so, we're familiar with abortion providers in this movement and the way that they respect the autonomy of patients. But that's not true of all medical care professionals, especially those who oppose abortion and want to try to interfere with patients' decision-making when a patient comes to them first, before they go to the clinic. So we talked with Chloe Hebert, who manages the National Abortion Federation Hotline Fund, the National Abortion Referral and Assistance Hotline. She told us all sorts of stories because she has heard from patients who have faced sabotage from their physicians, such as, she told us, primary care physicians who withhold ultrasound results from patients who request them when going to an abortion clinic, or physicians who misinform patients about ultrasound results so that it seems the patient is too far into her pregnancy to have an abortion. Professionals who refuse to refer patients to an abortion provider or won't return phone calls from patients they know have decided to have an abortion. Chloe finished this list exasperated, telling us, "I will never get over medical professionals who willfully sabotage their patients' access to abortion." We also cover gag rules, and we're familiar maybe with Title 10, which is the federal restriction on Title 10 restrictions that President Trump reinstituted early on in his presidency, and last year they were allowed to go into effect, which restricts certain referrals with respect to abortion clinics from publicly funded family planning clinics. But there are other restrictions like gag rules in place. For instance, in Kentucky, nurses who examine patients in hospitals following a rape are prohibited from talking to those patients about abortion. Women who seek medical care in Arkansas, Michigan, Nebraska, Ohio, and Wisconsin, providers there who receive state funds related to family planning or other sexuality-based programs are prohibited from counseling them about abortion. These kinds of things prevent patients from getting the necessary information that they need from other medical care providers once they have made, or as they are making the decision to have an abortion. I'll turn it over to Carol to talk about the next section.
Hi, well, again, great to be with you. Chapter 3, we talk about finding and getting to a clinic. As you can see, it's hard to find in large part, as David said earlier, all these crisis pregnancy centers. The numbers are staggering. In fact, if you look here, almost 1,600 known abortion providers. And that figure, by the way, does not refer to individual clinicians. It refers to facilities. So a certain facility obviously may have more than one doctor or other clinician working there. Although some doctors work at a number of clinics. So it's hard to really pin down the actual number of abortion providers. But we know it's more or less that. And we compare this to over 3,000 crisis pregnancy centers. So for people looking for abortions who don't have a supportive network and who certainly don't have a supportive primary care or OBGYN who's going to refer them, it's not so simple getting to the right place. But really what's difficult, and was a real eye-opener to me, and if you look at my gray head, I have studied this field for many, many, many years. And what really surprised me was just how the difficulties many women have just getting to a clinic. Obviously COVID, and we'll talk about the pandemic somewhat separately. I mean, that's obviously made things much harder. But even in the pre-pandemic era, if we can all remember such a time, it was very, very hard just to get to a clinic for many women. And I noticed that Odile Shalit, who's from the Bridget Alliance, I noticed that she's on this call, and I'm very glad to see her here. She runs something called the Bridget Alliance. Some of you may know about that. That's an organization that helps, that does exactly that. It helps people get to the places they need to get. And of course, there's a number of other funds. NAF has a lot of patient assistance funds, the National Network of Abortion Funds. Certainly that was one of the major take-homes from the interviews David and I did, just how hard it was to get to places for many women, and how absolutely essential the work of the various funds are. And that raises really an interesting question for me. One thing we found out, as I've just been suggesting, is just the extraordinary importance of volunteer groups. David and I divided our interviewees into 3 groups. One was providers, and I should say by providers, we mean not only doctors and advanced practice clinicians who actually provide abortion. We also talk, for us providers also became the people, primarily women, who run clinics. So we talked to providers. We also talk to what we call allies or advocates. These are people in organizations like the Bridget Alliance, like the National Network of Abortion Funds, like the National Abortion Federation. But we also talk to volunteers. people who not only escort at clinics, which has become a familiar part of the abortion landscape, but now more and more we see volunteers just getting people to where they need to go. We have an extraordinary story in our book that's sort of long, so I won't read it. But I mean, this story just blew my mind. It took place at a clinic in the South. It was one of the states that has only one clinic. Fortunately, this state has a very robust, this clinic has a very robust volunteer group, not who escort, but also transport patients. So this volunteer we spoke to was called and said, would you pick up someone who lives about an hour away, and would you take her to the clinic for her appointment? She doesn't have a car. And the volunteer said, sure. So she did. She picked her up. She took her to the clinic. It was supposed to be a 2-day procedure, so they had arranged a hotel room for this patient. Turns out the patient was over the gestational limit, had very high blood pressure. The clinic did not feel safe doing her. And by the way, that's another problem that we noticed in many cases. In states where there's only a couple clinics who may have gestational limits, very often patients have to be, quote, turned away, which, by the way, is the name of a very important study done by my colleague at Answer. She has a new book coming out on the turnaway study, which I recommend to all of you. But anyway, back to the story. The story was that this clinic couldn't see her. They were advised to go to Washington, D.C. They thought a clinic there could help her. They went, so this volunteer, who by the way was a woman in her late 60s, drove this patient to Washington. The clinic there couldn't see her. I mean, again, the health care problems of this patient made the clinic feel uneasy about doing her. Finally, they were sent to New York. I mean, those of you, you're all on the East Coast, or most of you are. Not so simple, DC to New York, but they did it. They get to New York, they go to a clinic, the clinic does do it. This is a 2-day procedure. What rarely, but sometimes happens in these cases, the patient will start to actually miscarry during the night. That's what happened. They're in the hotel room. The patient wakes up, she's on the toilet, she can't get off the toilet, she's passing the pregnancy. Sorry for all this graphic stuff, but this is the world we're dealing with. They call the EMTs, they get her to a hospital. This driver, the volunteer, this all happens at 3 a.m., has not slept all night. The next day, after the patient finally is taken care of in the hospital, they get back in the car. Now we're talking about a 12-hour ride during a blinding rainstorm where periodically they had to stop and get off the road because they couldn't see. The end of the story is, all this, I should have told you, all this happens the day of Christmas Eve. The driver had promised the patient, I'll get you home for Christmas so you'll be with your kids at Christmas. They get home at 12:01 Christmas Day. Anyway, an extraordinary story. Most volunteer operations do not involve a 3-day odyssey and 12-hour harrowing drives. But this is the end of a spectrum of how just incredibly dependent people, abortion patients are on volunteers. And just to end this segment, let me say that on one hand, I find it deeply, deeply moving what kind of extraordinary commitments people have to our movement, and the willingness of people like this to open their houses in some cases, to go on 3-day odysseys or whatever it takes. But I leave you with a question, is this an adequate way to do healthcare? I mean, the phrase from Tennessee Williams' play, I've always depended on the kindness of strangers, that keeps going through my head because, what if this particular patient was at a clinic where they did not have this salt of the earth volunteer? So there'll always be a place for volunteer work in the abortion field. But let me just end by saying, I think it's gotten out of balance. You can't do healthcare depending on volunteers who may or may not be available. But do not hear me say anything other than utmost respect for the dedication you find among people in fields like this. So David, let's go on to the next one.
So our next chapter was talking about money. When we started the interview, one of the first questions we asked people, the providers, allies, and volunteers, was what's the biggest barrier that your patients face? And almost everyone told us the same thing, that it's money. And why? Because half of abortion patients around the country are at or below the poverty line. And another quarter of patients around the country are between 100 and 200% of the poverty line, considered low income. So what that means is that paying for abortion is really difficult. Comparatively, abortion isn't that expensive of a medical procedure. The average price of an abortion around the country in 2014, the data we had when we wrote this, for an abortion at 10 weeks was $508 for procedural abortion, and for medication abortion, $535. For abortion at 20 weeks, the average price was just under $1,200, and it goes up a lot after that. But compared to a lot of other medical procedures, this is not that expensive medical care. But for people who are at or below the poverty line, or either at 200% of the poverty line or below, these are amounts of money that are incredibly difficult to come up with. Especially when you throw in, and the situation doesn't fall proportionate or evenly upon people based on race, given the connection between race and poverty in this country, and the difficulty that people have, people of color with structural racism and barriers to economic advancement have in amassing money to be able to pay for things that we're talking about here. So for low-income people who can't afford health care, we have a program in this country, Medicaid, whose entire goal when it was created in 1965 was to make it so that people didn't have to make the difficult choice between health care and other life's necessities, such as housing, food, clothing, shelter, and childcare. With Medicaid. With Medicaid, people would be able to say, I don't have to take money from those other buckets and pay for health care because now it would be covered. This program in 1976 was changed dramatically, and a change that continues to this day with what we all call the Hyde Amendment. This is named after Representative Henry Hyde, a member of Congress who was rabidly anti-abortion. And in 1976, 3 years after Roe v. Wade, he stood on the floor of Congress and said that what he wanted to do was really overturn Roe, but he couldn't do that. So this is what he said: constitutional amendments that prohibit abortion stay languishing in subcommittee, much less committee. And so the only vehicle here that the members of Congress may work their will, unfortunately, is an appropriation bill. I regret that. I certainly would like to prevent, if I could legally, anybody having an abortion, a rich woman, a middle-class woman, or a poor woman. Unfortunately, the only vehicle is the Medicaid bill. A life is a life. The life of a little ghetto kid is just as important as the life of a rich person. And so we proceed with this bill. And so what the Hyde Amendment did was prohibit the use of federal dollars through the Medicaid program in paying for abortions under this form of health insurance. The US Supreme Court said in 1977 and 1980 that the Hyde Amendment was constitutional, that it did not go against the idea of Roe v. Wade because people are still able to, according to the Supreme Court, make the decision to have an abortion, and the Hyde Amendment doesn't stop them from making that decision. The government is not responsible for paying for a decision once made. Justice Thurgood Marshall, the court's only African-American justice at the time, was very clear about what would happen to women who could not afford an abortion but still sought one out because of this Hyde Amendment. He wrote, "If abortion is medically necessary and a funded abortion is unavailable, they must resort to back alley butchers, attempt to induce an abortion themselves by crude and dangerous methods, or suffer the serious medical consequences of attempting to carry the fetus to term. Because legal abortion is not a realistic option for such women, the predictable result of the Hyde Amendment will be a significant increase in the number of poor women who will die or suffer significant health damage because of an inability to procure necessary medical services." And he noted the connection between race and poverty. He said, "The class burdened by the Hyde Amendment consists of indigent women, a substantial portion of whom are members of minority races. As I have written before, non-white women obtain abortions at nearly double the rate of whites." And he said, "The Hyde Amendment is designed to deprive poor and minority women of the constitutional right to choose abortion." And we've seen that what Justice Marshall wrote, not necessarily the connection with death, because we know of Rosie Jimenez and her death in 1976 or 7 because of the Hyde Amendment. But what we know is that the Hyde Amendment has been successful in limiting people's options. Studies that have been released in 2009 and then more recently out of Answer in 2019 show that a quarter of women on Medicaid who want to have an abortion are unable to get one because of the Hyde Amendment, because they're unable to afford to do so. And then a significant number of women who are able to have an abortion, despite the Hyde Amendment, are delayed in doing so because they have to come up with the money. Now, how do they come up with the money? They sell things that they own because they have to give them up. They forego paying rent, they forego electricity, they forego diapers, clothing, other things. But they also get the help of abortion funds, and abortion funds are an essential part, and Carol talked about the volunteers who make up so much of the practical aspect of how abortion actually happens in this country, and volunteers and paid staff at abortion funds are essential to that, and we talk about that a lot in the book. We also talked about clinics that provide discounts, and so that's something that clinic owners, clinic administrators, they provide discounts when patients are unable to do this. This doesn't mean that everyone who wants an abortion is able to get one, but it does mean a larger number of people are able to get one than otherwise would be able to. All in all, what this does to abortion care for patients who have to come up with their own money, who have to connect with funds, is that, as one director told us, it's like playing a game of abortion Tetris, where you're trying to lock in all these little pieces into their exact place in order to actually get an abortion. So patients who are maneuvering through their own life problems, maneuvering through their own healthcare issues and making this decision and trying to carry it out are also having to be almost project managers, working with clinics, funds, volunteers, to try and make the money work to get an abortion. When, if this were other form of medical care that was covered under Medicaid, Medicaid would cover it. Medicaid isn't perfect, far from it, but Medicaid would cover it and they wouldn't have to be dealing with this. So that's our fourth chapter, talking about money. So after coming up with the money, then people have to get into the clinic. And getting into the clinic involves dealing with protesters, something that a lot of people are familiar with, and this is the chapter we talk about this. So getting into a clinic because of protesters is something that is unique to abortion, just like most of what we're talking about here. It's hard to imagine a situation, any other situation in medical care, where entering your doctor's office or the clinic or a hospital would involve having to go through throngs of protesters who are trying to, calling you names, demeaning your decision, trying to get you to leave the place, calling the people in there people who are going to harm you or worse. But that's the situation that abortion patients face around the country. Now, the specific details vary clinic by clinic. We talked with people who have 1 or 2 protesters on a regular basis, to people who have hundreds, and sometimes literally thousands of protesters outside their clinic. The protesters routinely intimidate, shame, harass, and harangue people who are doing nothing more than entering a medical clinic and trying to get the care that they want. In no other area of medicine are patients subjected to this kind of harassment just for walking in. Some localities have tried to limit the impact of these protesters, but the Supreme Court has made that difficult. As a result, the burden is on clinics and their volunteers to try and protect patients from this form of harassment. But even the most effective response still leaves women seeking abortion services feeling at best attacked and at worst physically stressed in ways that hinder good medical care. Now, the numbers, the Turnaway study that Carol talked about produced some numbers, said that, sorry, I lost my place here. So the Turnaway study said that 70% of clinics said that protesters were almost always there. Over half of the patients reported not seeing or hearing protesters, but the other half said they did, and for some of them it had a big impact on them. What this means is that patients, again, not every patient, because a lot of patients deal with protesters in ways that they are not bothered by them, and they just walk through it and they get their care. But providers told us stories of patients who came in agitated, whose blood pressure was elevated, who were not able to relax because of the protesters, and it affected them emotionally, and sometimes that makes medical care more difficult to provide. And empirical studies have shown the same thing in terms of the effect that protesters have on patients. Some places have tried to deal with this, and we talked with people around the country who have worked in clinics where there are buffer zones, and buffer zones are a fixed amount of space outside of a clinic in which protesters can't come or approach the provider or the patients. Everyone we talked to who has worked at a clinic with a buffer zone said positive things about it. They didn't say it was perfect, but they said positive things. And Jen Castle, who's a nurse practitioner, who's worked in multiple northeastern states, one in particular that had a buffer zone, she explained to us that she was always relieved for everyone involved because the protesters weren't right in people's faces going in the door. They were pushed back to a place that felt safer for everybody. Susan Smith also worked in a buffer zone, although it changed because of court order. And she said the difference was palpable. Without the buffer zone, the patients enter the clinic agitated because they're swarmed on the sidewalk. But with the buffer zone, the patients complain much less about the protesters, so she and her colleagues can start the patient's visit by addressing the care the patient needs rather than talking about the protesters. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, in 2014, issued a decision, McCullen versus Coakley, which cast great doubt on the constitutionality of buffer zones. It struck down a 35-foot buffer zone in Massachusetts. There are a series of cases in the country out of Chicago and Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Englewood, New Jersey, trying to see if smaller buffer zones are constitutional, and the lower courts so far have approved them and said they are constitutional, and we'll see if the Supreme Court has anything to say about that. The final thing I want to just talk about here, and Carol mentioned it briefly, is the role of escorts. And we talked to a bunch of people who were escorts or providers who rely on escorts. And they all said that escorts provide an essential service to help patients getting into clinics in terms of greeting patients with a smile, making them feel that someone's on their team, that someone's going to protect them, and giving them an opportunity to have someone greet them and be a buffer from the screaming and harassing and the aggressive people who are protesting on the other side. Again, sort of echoing a theme of the book and what we talked about, with all the harassment that patients face entering a clinic, it may seem a wonder that abortion patients endure it, but they do. And to Jada Curry, another person we talked to, this makes sense. She said, patients, they want an abortion, so whatever they have to do to make that happen, they're troopers. They do it. They shouldn't have to, but they do it. Carol, let's turn to you again.
Okay, thank you. And before I talk about counseling, let me just add on a comment about escorts. Escorts, as we to repeat what's been said, is we found out from virtually everybody we talked to how important they are. One of the problems now in the pandemic is that escorts are being asked not to come for their own protection. The protesters, by the way, are still showing up. But I mean, in fact, I am proud to say as a Bay Area person, the first arrest made in San Francisco for somebody violating the stay in place order was a protester at a Planned Parenthood clinic. But in most cases, protesters don't get arrested. Anyway, but the more seriously, the problem is that abortion patients now, for the most part, are not having the protection and the service of escorts. Okay, but counseling. Let me start by repeating to you something that we quoted in the book, but this was something told to me years ago when I first started studying this field. It was told to me by Dr. Curtis Boyd, who's a very long time provider in this field. He runs the clinic both in New Mexico, Southwestern Women's Options, as well as another clinic in Dallas. Anyway, of someone who's been thinking about abortion care, not only since Roe, but even before Roe. And what Dr. Boyd said to me is, every patient is different. With one you laugh, with one you cry, with one you tell stories, with one you're quiet. And that struck me as very perceptive at the time. I believe it is still true. And all the regulations we have about counseling violate that. One thing that the various state laws about counseling, and we talk about them at length in this chapter, is everybody has to be treated the same. And not only does everybody have to be treated the same, in a number of states, there's mandated scripts, and the only way to describe it is lies. I mean, in about 5 states, and I'm not sure I'm remembering exactly the numbers, but in a number of states, patients are told that abortion is associated with breast cancer. Not true. Been studied extensively, not true. Patients in other states are told this will make it more difficult for you to have children. That abortion is associated with suicide, with mental health issues. The mental health issues, of course, the so-called post-abortion syndrome has been again studied extensively by the American Psychological Association, by the American Psychiatric Association. Not true, as the former president of the American Psychiatric Association said, it's a made-up disease. It doesn't exist. However, it was endorsed by the Supreme Court in its one of its decisions, when the Chief Justice said, even though we have no reliable data, it stands to reason that there are psychological problems following an abortion. Anyway, so what happens in the real world at the clinics is that counselors, or in other cases, the clinicians, have to tell patients really lies. And as you see here from this quote, one of the providers we talked about said, I get this question all the time. If it's not medically true, why do you have to say it? I mean, think how bizarre it is from the perspective of a patient to walk into a clinic and be told something, and then to have the person telling you this, the medical authority person, saying, what I just told you isn't true. And for a lot of providers, this is very, very difficult. I mean, it's a profound violation of professional ethics. You don't lie to patients and scare the hell out of them. In both the Dakotas, and in a couple other states as well, patients need to be told you are, quote, terminating the life of a whole, separate, unique, living human being, which leads the patients to ask very reasonably, so this is legal. Is this legal? I mean, the patient has just been told you are about to commit murder, and then has to has to be told, yeah, you are. Well, you're not really are, but the state makes you say that. And no, you're not really committing murder. You know, I think it's fair to say most patients, it just rolls off. They want their abortion. They're just tuning out this stuff. But other patients take it very seriously. So what kind of counseling does go on at the clinic these days? I mean, one of the problems with these mandated scripts that are, for lack of a more technical term, bullshit, one of the problems is it takes away time for what should be real, authentic counseling. Now, most women who come to clinics have a very high degree of what social scientists have called, quote, decisional certainty, much more so than some other procedures where people are a lot more ambivalent about. But so arguably these patients need a minimum of counseling. They certainly need informed consent. It is the standard in all good clinics to make sure that the patient, it's your decision, not somebody else who's coercing you. You've given the information that all patients should get before any kind of medical procedure. Most patients don't need more extensive counseling. At the very beginning of legal abortion in this country, in the early 70s, right after Roe, there was a lot more. I mean, this was a new field. People are feeling their way around. But not everybody has this degree of decisional certainty. Some portion of patients come to the clinic ambivalent, conflicted, maybe they're very religious or whatever. I mean, not everybody has this degree of decisional certainty. And the abortion providing field has actually developed very intelligent ways to deal with it. I noticed before that Charlotte Taft was on the call. I don't know if she's still here now or not. Charlotte, if you're here, say hi in the chat room. Charlotte Taft is one of the innovators of something that has been referred to as, quote, head and heart counseling, to make sure the patient's head and heart are in line. She may intellectually realize, you know, I can't have a baby now, I have no money, I'm living in a shelter or whatever. But her heart may say, this is wrong, I think I'm committing murder. So what a number of clinics have done following, and Charlotte and her colleagues were among the pioneers of this, is do needs assessment, ask patients beforehand to fill out a form, just checking how they feel about abortion. Do you think it's wrong? And so forth. And patients who need extra time for counseling get it. Some patients, depending on the circumstances, depending how far along they are in gestational length, are told, you know, go home, you can come back tomorrow. Think it over. Most patients do come back. Not everybody does. I mean, that's what good abortion care is. It's really, to use another phrase very common in this field, you know, meeting the patient where she's at. Let me just read you one thing. Another thing that clinics are, and a number of states are forced to do, is show the patient her ultrasound and describe it. Now, it's changing somewhat now because of the pandemic, and we'll get to that. But until at the time we did these interviews, it was the standard of care in most places to do an ultrasound before a procedure. But that doesn't mean that the patient was forced to look at it. So let me read you from a provider who runs a clinic in a southern state that requires clinics to display and describe the ultrasound image. Quote, she explained how her clinic implements the law. After going through the state-mandated script, the sonographer says to the patient, I have to have the machine towards you. You don't have to look, but I have to set it up. If you are far enough along that there's a heartbeat, I have to turn the sound on you for you to hear it, unless you tell me you don't want to. You're free to have a copy of the ultrasound at no additional cost. I am required by law to describe to you the development I see based on this ultrasound while I'm doing this. And then the provider went on to explain to us, you have to be descriptive about the fingers, toes, you know, everything you're seeing. The patients often have very strong reactions to this. The provider said the most common patient reaction is, quote, "You've got to be fucking kidding me, for real." Anyway, some patients just find this absurd. Others, of course, find it very upsetting. Some providers tell us about, you know, patients start crying when, you know, when the sonographer is going through, here's the toes, here's the this, here's the that. Now my patient, not my patients, I'm sorry. My colleagues at Answer have actually studied the impact of ultrasound. It changes very few minds. Women who are in a clinic for an abortion, being shown the ultrasound, having described it, changes very few minds. Of the minds that are changed, those are the people who were ambivalent to begin with. So we can conclude this is yet another manifestation of state-mandated cruelty to abortion patients that really serve no other purpose. Yeah, so David, let's move on.
So moving on to chapter 7, so patients have gotten into a clinic, they've gotten the counseling, and now they have to wait. You know, we're all familiar with waiting when it comes to medical care, but the waiting that we're familiar with is waiting because the medical care provider needs us to wait because they are seeing other patients or tests take a long time. And it's a common complaint with medical care. But what studies have shown is that abortion providers are really masters of timeliness and efficiency. According to data from the Guttmacher Institute, the average wait time for an abortion appointment in the United States is just over 7 days, with over 3/4 of abortion patients able to see a provider within 7 days of calling for an appointment. And in a minority of states, patients who show up in an abortion clinic can get sometimes a procedure the same day they're there. And here you see a quote from Andrea Ferrigno, who works in several different clinics for several different states. And she says, if a patient comes and says, I want to have an appointment to have an abortion, do you have anything today? We can see them today. It's really great to be able to do that. If the clinic has the availability. No one, she says, really just wakes up one morning saying, I'll just have an abortion today. They've thought about it. We don't have to regulate that or police when they decided they were going to have an abortion. They just happen to walk in today, and if we have the availability to do it, we will. This is the flexibility that providers have in places where there's no state-mandated delay. But a majority of states have state-mandated delay. 27 states have it. The bulk of them have 24-hour waiting periods. 3 states have 48-hour waiting periods, while 5 states go further and have a 72-hour required delay. South Dakota being the most burdensome because their 72 hours does not count weekends or holidays, so that can make it even longer. Mandatory delays are not just about the hours. They also vary based on whether the initial visit can happen in person or has to happen in person or over the phone. So if a patient has to call first, get counseling over the phone, and then come in 24 or 48 hours later, that's certainly less burdensome than a patient who has to show up in person at the clinic twice. And then the most burdensome places, which are several states, require not only that a doctor provide the initial counseling, so it takes the doctor away from performing procedures to do the initial counseling and then have to come back 48 hours or 24 hours later to see another doctor, but that it be the same doctor who provide the initial counseling and do the procedure. This can be a logistical nightmare for clinics, add-on, and also very burdensome for patients. Studies have shown that these mandatory delays do not cause patients to question their decision and do not turn away most patients, but what it does do is that patients wind up taking a lot longer than the minimum period of time because of logistics in their own life or the clinic. And it's really burdensome in places where clinics are have many different doctors because they schedules, or just the logistics of having a medical practice and having to keep track of the same doctor performing the counseling and the procedure. And I will just tell you the one story of a doctor who works in a state that has a 2-visit requirement and also requires the same doctor provide the initial consult and the abortion. This is Douglas Laub, a doctor in the Midwest. He said that where he practices, this requirement is particularly onerous for women who want to have a medication abortion, because I have to be the one on the schedule that they come back and see. If he's on the schedule for another week or two, which sometimes happens, the patient might be pushed out of the window for having a medication abortion. If he's the doctor who did the initial consult, Douglas said, I have to then literally break the bubble pack and push the pill into the palm of their hand and then watch them swallow it, and then make sure it stays down and give them instructions on taking the next pill at home. He has to watch the clock carefully when he's doing the initial consultation so that he doesn't finish so late that he won't be on the schedule the next day at that exact same time. He's been an abortion physician for several decades and has practiced in multiple states. This new aspect of the law, he called it a charade. It's just a total waste of time. For the most part, Supreme Court has approved waiting periods, 24-hour waiting periods in particular. There are some state courts that have struck down longer waiting periods. But almost everyone we talked to about waiting periods said that there is absolutely no benefit for the patients, and it is all burden. Erica Valverde, another doctor, summed up the feelings of everyone we talked to. She said, for the government to be so bold as to say, this is the time you need to think about your decision. I can't think of anything more condescending, especially when someone has probably already made their decision and thought about it before even getting pregnant. It's an arbitrary rule. Carol?
Yeah. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I see time is inevitably marching on, and we want to be able to interact with you. Okay, so talking about the procedure itself, and early on, I think as David was introducing our book, he mentioned that a very important concept for us writing this book is the one of, quote, abortion exceptionalism. The idea that abortion is treated like no other field of medicine. And when we talk about the procedure, this is a prime example. I mean, just the regulation by legislatures who have no medical degree, whatsoever, telling a branch of medicine how it should operate is just really unprecedented. Sometimes it reaches ludicrous extremes. Some of you might remember that a while ago, a legislature, I believe in South Dakota, but I could be wrong, raised a question, if there's an ectopic pregnancy, can't you take it out and put it in the uterus? That doesn't happen. Anyway, so abortion procedures are very regulated. The 17 states ban telemedicine even as they use it for other things. In Texas, for example, which bans telemedicine for abortion, it's a huge state, a lot of telemedicine. Of course, with COVID, telemedicine has taken a new prominence, and hopefully we'll get to that before long. So there's just no reason. The only reason is to make abortion less accessible. One of the most important possible breakthroughs, or in some cases already breakthroughs with respect to abortion access, is allowing advanced practice clinicians, that is nurse practitioners, midwives, and physician assistants, to provide abortion. They have an excellent track record. We're talking here about, for the most part, first trimester abortions. I noticed Dr. Hearn is on the call. Dr. Hearn is one of the few providers in this country, along with Dr. Boyd's clinic in New Mexico, and in Maryland, you have Dr. Carhart's clinic. Now in DC, more recently, we have DuPont Clinic. But really, we only have 4 clinics that openly provide third trimester procedures. And this is different, obviously, and we'll get to that. This is different than APC provision. 90% of abortions in this country approximately take place in the first trimester. APCs really came into their own as providers when medication abortion was approved in this country in 2000. As I'm sure most of you know, if not all of you know, medication abortion means giving patients two drugs, one to take at the time, one to take 24 or 48 hours later. What the skill set needed for medication abortion is being a good communicator. You're giving patients instructions. This is when you take these pills. This is when you should call. This is a sign that you should call back if you think you're bleeding too much or whatever. And also, of course, you have to be able to accurately be confident in the length of gestation. Medication abortion, at the time we wrote this book, medication abortion was used up through 10 weeks of pregnancy. In response to the pandemic, many clinics have now moved and have concluded it is safe through 11 weeks. Some APCs, like for example in California, also provide aspiration abortion using a manual vacuum aspirator. A number of states allow that, but all states should allow this. There's medication abortion in particular was approved in this country in the year 2000. So we have 20 years of an excellent safety record. The bans on APCs, again, serve no medical, have no medical justification. They are politics overriding science. One of the most worrisome things going on now with the regulation of procedures, a number of states have banned D&Es, dilation and it should be evacuation. That's a mistake to say extraction. The most common form of abortion in second trimester. There's a long unhappy story here, and but I'll make it a short unhappy story. A number of years ago, many of you might remember the so-called partial birth abortion scandal. The scandal being that George W. Bush signed, and the Senate and the House passed a ban on a fairly rarely used technique of second trimester abortion, which was called, it was a variation of the D&E. It was called dilation and extraction, and that's why I mistakenly put it there. That was banned. There is no such term as, and there's, in the medical literature, partial birth abortion does not exist. This was a made-up term. It was sensationalized. It was a very effective technique of the anti-abortion movement. When the Supreme Court upheld it, what Justice Anthony Kennedy said was, well, it's not such a big deal because the doctor still will be able to do D&Es, dilation and evacuation. Which in fact was and still is the most common form of abortion in the second trimester. Now there's a movement to ban those. It has not yet reached the Supreme Court. I shudder to think what happened when it will. But I mean, this is very, very worrisome. If the Supreme Court should ban the D&Es, women will be left with a not very good option. Third trimester abortions, and again, we have a third tri provider here with us, the method is called induction. In other words, patients are induced to go through labor. I mean, that has to happen in third trimester abortions, or maybe it doesn't have to happen, and Dr. Hearn, feel free to put in the chat box any mistakes you hear me saying. But it's not a pleasant process, and D&Es are quicker, cheaper, can be done more with less emotional upset to the patient. So if these are banned, it would really, really be a tragedy. And let me say, just in terms of, to you NARAL people, in terms of, thinking about the political meaning of this, if the Supreme Court will ban, we'll say Roe is overturned, millions of women, we assume, and men, and gender fluid people will come out into the streets. If the Supreme Court bans a technique, a procedure that most people probably have never heard of, I don't think millions of people will come out on the streets. So this is very worrisome. The last thing I want to say about the procedure is that hospitals now only do about 4% of abortions. These are, and some of this is reasonable. There's no reason to go into a hospital for a first trimester procedure. It can be done much more cheaply and arguably in a more user-friendly way in a freestanding clinic. But once you get later into abortion, into pregnancy, and once you get very sick women, the skittishness of hospitals to do abortions, it becomes very, very worrisome. Chris France, who directs the only clinic in Cleveland, preterm, as she told a reporter, the only way we can send a very sick patient to a hospital is if she's dying, and she'll probably be dead by the time she gets there. I mean, so hospitals are so nervous about especially in the redder states, but not only, are so nervous about the political ramifications of doing an abortion in a hospital that that clinics are put in a very, very, very difficult position. Clinics are put in the position of having to take chances on doing abortions on women that they would much prefer be seen in a hospital, but they know that the hospitals are too nervous to see them. And I'll close this part of the webinar by saying that as one researcher told me, in her state, doctors are told in a hospital, if you're going to do an abortion in a hospital, be prepared to